All right, so welcome everyone once again. My name is Kristen Anderson. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the branch manager of Ideas for Us. And if you're not familiar with us, we're a global environmental nonprofit. I'm going to talk a little bit about more about what we do in a minute. But first, I just want to thank you all so much for coming out to this event. Even if it's from your living room, it's really important to come to these conversations and grow with one another and learn from one another as well. This is our first of hopefully many environmental justice workshops as we look into the many different aspects of environmental injustices, not only in our community, but in the country and around the world. And we're doing this in partnership with Poder Latinx and Fridays for Future, as well as Ideas for Us, Orlando, and UCF. And we have the wonderful Amber Tamm here to talk about food justice with us today. But before we get into that conversation, I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about Ideas for Us and what we do in the community. So, like I said, we're a global environmental nonprofit headquartered here out of Orlando, and we work to educate the community on environmental issues and then engage them in eco action projects. So, we don't just stop at the education, we also give people opportunities to take hands on action. Because if you know about environmental issues, chances are you want to do something about it, but a lot of people don't know where to start. And so we give people opportunities to implement long-term climate solutions in our community and through our branches around the world in those communities. Each branch, we do have local leaders there because we really believe in mobilizing leaders and identifying global problems, but coming up with local solutions. We focus on a different pillar of sustainability each month in order to keep everything integrated, and we align all of our projects with the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And so, like I said, every month we do this by hosting a hive meeting to educate the community. We also do workshops like this to further the conversation. And then we plan and organize with a team of volunteers to create projects that identify local solutions. And then we implement those solutions by making it open to the community. And this can take so many different forms: tree planting, shoreline restoration projects, waste audits, urban agriculture, and solar workshops. So if you're interested in any of this, this is the organization to be a part of, and I'll talk about our upcoming events at the end. So now I'm going to hand it over to my good friend Jen, if you want to go ahead and talk about Poder Latinx.
Yes, hey everybody. Like Kristen said, my name is Jen. I'm the environmental organizer at Poder Latinx in Florida. I've worked with Poder for almost a year now, and our work focuses on uplifting the voices of the Latinx community, immigrants, and other people of color, specifically around the issues that most impact us. So that's immigrant, economic, and environmental justice. So those are the three areas of focus in our organization. We're present here in Florida. Our team has an office in Orlando, but we're also present in Arizona. And more recently, last year, we started an office in Georgia. So, we're targeting these communities that have a large population of Latinx folks, which oftentimes don't have a lot of resources or help. So that's our aim as a community organization. Like I said, currently I'm based in Orlando, and I've been working for this past year on mobilizing my community here around the environmental injustices that we see in our own backyard. So I wanted to start off this discussion just by kind of defining what we mean by environmental justice. Technically, this is defined as the fair treatment and involvement of all people, but especially minorities, in the development and implementation and enforcement of environmental laws, policies, and regulations. And by saying that we want environmental justice, we mean that we don't want any of our communities to bear a disproportionate share of the negative consequences of climate and the climate crisis. It's been a known fact for a very long time that at a national level, facilities where we dump our garbage and process dangerous chemicals are primarily located in low-income communities, which also happen to be minority communities. These findings and this environmental justice movement were started by a group of community advocates in Warren County, North Carolina in the 80s. If you all have heard of them, they're the pioneers of the environmental justice movement. And Warren County is and was a majority Black community. And basically these community members fought against the placement of a landfill of like toxic chemicals in soil in their neighborhood. But unfortunately, they didn't win their fight. The government still went ahead and used their community as a dump site, even after all, the community outrage and mobilization. So yeah, the government failed them. And this is something that we continue to see, like a continuous disregard for brown and black lives at the hands of the government, who refuse to implement adequate environmental laws that protect these communities. And from this movement that started in Warren County, they started investigating, right? And that's when we started finding out that most of these facilities were in low income and brown and black neighborhoods. Today, communities of color continue to be disproportionately affected, not only by environmental burdens like this, but also by extreme weather coming from the climate crisis and other climate disasters. Our communities are still more likely to be near these toxic power plants and facilities. We have higher degrees of pollution, and we have less access to resources to be able to deal with these hazards, especially the Latinx community and other people of color who have a language barrier. A lot of the times organizations that are in the fight for environmental regulations and stuff, they don't really have resources in Spanish or Creole, for example, to reach the communities that are most being impacted by this. So, we know that all of these things are happening. We know that Black families in Flint don't have access to clean water. Immigrant families in California are at the forefronts of the climate crisis, facing extreme weather while they're being paid, really, really low paying job, while they're working really, really low paying jobs. And Indigenous communities and their way of life are being threatened by unfair oil developments and a warming planet. So when we speak about environmental justice, we mean that our community should not be dealing with any of these injustices because of their race or their income bracket. And by acknowledging this inequality and putting people of color at the center of any and all environmental work, we hope to build an equitable future where all of our communities, but especially ours who have been historically mistreated, neglected, and forgotten, are protected from environmental hazards and burdens. So Kristen, if you can go to the next slide, please. Oh, I have some, those pictures were just of some of the movements on environmental justice. But so here in Orlando, where I said I was based, we're no strangers to environmental injustice. Apartheids Latinx, we're specifically focusing right now on the pollution caused by OUC, which is our primary utilities company. They have a coal plant sitting in the middle of communities that have a large percentage of people of color. This picture is of the Staten Energy Center, where OUC burns coal and has these huge piles of coal ash. And if you've ever driven nearby, you can't miss it. This coal ash is uncovered, and it has detrimental health effects, such as respiratory illnesses like asthma for our children and our elders. And coal-fired power plants are actually also the biggest source of greenhouse gases in the United States. So after a whole bunch of community outrage for not only our health, but for our planet, OUC promised to stop burning coal last year and transition to natural gas instead. And this decision came after a series of community meetings that they hosted in an effort to bring in the community, because the community was saying, we're the ones that are impacted, we should be a part of this conversation. But unfortunately, OUC held these meetings at like really inconvenient times in the middle of work days, really like at 2 p.m., for example, on a Monday, where most working class people are at work and aren't able to attend. Their last meeting right before the vote on the EIRP was actually on a Monday or Tuesday at 2 p.m. and it lasted until like 6:30. So obviously people with families and working class people cannot just take 4.5 hours out of their day to attend this meeting in order to be able to talk or express their concerns. I went to an OUC meeting last week or 2 weeks ago, and they didn't even let me in after on the website it specifically said that as long as you follow protocol with the mask and you keep your distance, they were going to let a couple of people in, and not a lot of people show up for these meetings anyway, so I know the capacity wasn't like maxed out. So obviously OUC, they leave the community out of their decisions. This isn't an accident, the fact that they do these meetings at such inconvenient times. And they decided to transition to natural gas, which of course is not what our communities need. Transitioning to burning another fossil fuel is really not what we were hoping for. So That's just one of the examples of a toxic power plant that's located in some of our neighborhoods. And aside from the pollution that our communities face, there's also the problem of energy justice, which falls under environmental justice actually. So low-income families actually face higher energy burdens because of ineffective energy efficiency programs that would help them lower their utilities costs. So OUC is actually one of the utility companies in Florida, has the highest percentage of low-income customers at 33%. And their energy efficiency programs that they take so much pride in actually help less than 1% of their eligible low-income customers. So that's about 70 people in total in the whole area that they service. So if you're from Orlando, you probably pay your bills to OUC. That's just how big they are. They service the greater part of Orlando. So these programs aren't adequate, and they take so much pride behind them. They're saying like, we don't know why the community is so upset. We're helping people the best we can, but we know that that's not true. By implementing better energy efficiency programs, not only would low-income people be able to pay their bills, they would save a lot of energy, but it's also great for our planet. But that's just a whole other conversation. So we know that energy access becomes a justice problem when companies begin to treat like energy access as a privilege and not a necessity for families and basically for everybody. You can't live without energy. So this, along with their predatory billing practices, especially in this global pandemic that again has disproportionately affected Brown and Black communities, and their pollution of our neighborhoods, just shows the reality of environmental justice here in Orlando. This is a recurrent theme in communities all over the United States, just like I mentioned in Warren County, but it's also a situation that we find in so many low-income Brown and Black communities all over the United States. And this issue around energy and dirty neighborhoods is only two of the problems on a long list of different environmental injustices that are facing our communities. So I'm glad to be in this space with you all. Thank you for coming. It's going to take a lot of community work to fix the systemic problems that are embedded in our country that allow these environmental injustices to continue to happen, even as this racism and this injustice is brought to light. So real quick, a little plug in here. If you want, yeah. So if you want to join me and Poder Latinx, right now I'm the only environmental organizer, so you can directly contact me. You can visit us at Poder_Latinx on Instagram, and you can just DM us there. Twitter is the same thing, just without the underscore. And then for all the other resources on the coal fight, sorry, and energy justice, I've began to create this landing page called poderlatinx.org/ecopoder. And you can find a whole list of like different resources, not only to learn about the coal fight, but also if you need help with your energy bills and your energy things. And there's resources in Spanish for your families and for yourself if you need it. We also put on a whole lot of webinars like this and educational things that are in Spanish. So if your family, your parents, or your grandparents, anybody who might need it, you can direct them to us, and we might be able to help, or we will be able to help them. So yeah, that's it for me. I'm gonna, oh, no, it's not. I want to invite you all to our community meetings, which is like really the heart of our coalition right now. These community meetings basically serve as a space for all of us to come together and talk about what we should do next in the coal fight, and how to best help and educate our community and any other concerns and ideas that are coming from the community. So we basically, at Poder Latinx, we want the community to tell us what they want us to do. We are a community organization, so we're here to listen and provide resources so that the community can take action. And I invite you all to come to these meetings if you're in East Orlando. So they're every other Thursday at 6 p.m. to 7. And you don't have to be Latinx or speak Spanish to come. Just so you know, we have translation. So if you speak Spanish or English, we accommodate both. And yeah, it's really, if you live in Orlando and you care about this issue, if you're a customer of OUC, I invite you to come. Even if you're not a customer of OUC, actually, one of our biggest volunteers, just an advocate that wants to help her family and friends who have high energy burdens, and isn't a OUC customer. So I invite you all to come, and I really hope to see some of you there. And with that, now I'm done. I want to pass it to our wonderful speaker and environmental justice advocate, Amber.
Hi, y'all. I'm just gonna try and make this quick as possible because I would prefer to chat with y'all, but I just wanted to educate on food justice, the origins, and like where it's heading today. But my name is Amber Tamm. I am a farmer, a floral designer, a horticulturalist. I am from Brooklyn. I'm 4 generations deep into Brooklyn, but I just moved to Virginia to start my own farm finally after farming for 5 years. I had the very odd privilege of farming in the migrant farm trail across the US, but not as an undocumented person or an immigrant. I'm from America, but I had the privilege to really sit and watch what was happening on the migrant farm trail to undocumented peoples. And it hit me in that time, in that space. And that's really where I became an advocate for farm workers and humanizing the food justice movement even more than it was previously. Um, so I'm really glad that you can come in, Noach. Sorry, my partner is bringing my charger. Thank you. Um, I am really glad to be here, and I'm so glad that I'm speaking after these two wonderful women because they pretty much schooled you on what environmental justice is. But just so we're all on the same page, environmental justice has many different facets, right? So we saw some of them covered in what Jen was just saying. But I'm just going to go through a couple so we can create the circle and then we can take food justice out. So some parts of environmental justice are things that have to do with fashion and fiber and clothing. There's also things pertaining to water rights, water pollution, ocean, drinking water. There's a lot of talk about waste, whether that's sanitation, plastic, recycling, or even compost. And then there's a lot of work around energy, which is what Jen was just talking about with green energy, solar energy, and using less fossil fuels, which leads directly into like what's going on in the air, as in what's going on in the soil, and soil leads directly into food justice, right? So when I looked up food justice today, and I looked up like food justice stats, these are the 3 stats that first came up, right? More than 1/3 of American adults, right, are obese, and 48% of those are African American adults. African American households face hunger 2 times the rate of white non-Hispanic households. And then one stat that I've always carried with me since being at the Feeding America conference is 57 million people on a national level are food insecure, right? So you can take any stat that you've seen in the past about hunger and food insecurity or food access. COVID has increased that by 40%. So that's where we're at. So what is food justice, right? What does it do, right? A quick definition, if you were to look it up, is food justice is a transformation of the current food system, included but not limited to eliminating disparities and inequalities, right? But a more wholesome definition is food justice is a holistic and structural view of the food system that sees healthy food as a human right and addresses the structural barriers to that right, right? So if there's anything that y'all remember, please let it be that, just the definition of food justice so we can all walk away a little bit more educated on that. And I'll repeat the definitions at the end because that's really the biggest takeaway. So why food justice? Why is it an important umbrella of environmental justice? And what is its connection to the larger environmental justice movement? Well, food justice essentially got its wings, its start, its flames from the environmental justice movement, but quickly became a, a more trendy, a more covered, like it's more covered in media, sort of environmental justice. But in its origins, it got its flames from criticizing the original environmental justice movement, right? So we saw food justice really come to life from certain environmentalists pointing at what the environmental justice movement was turning into, which was more commercial, more mainstream, which led to more elitism, which led to more predominant whiteness and white-centeredness. And so the consequence of all this elitism and whiteness led to the environmental justice movement to be more influenced by wilderness and scenery and nature and preserving those things rather than like the human aspect of it and the food aspect of it and what Jen was just talking about, more of these things that are affecting people rather than preserving land base. So what environmental justice aimed to be was a movement primarily led by the people most impacted by the environmental problems themselves, right? So connecting environmental health to the health of vulnerable communities and making sure that those communities have a say so in what happens. But because of that mainstreamism, they got off track. But food justice never got off track. Food justice does this flawlessly, where food justice efforts are, now it's normal for BIPOC folks to lead those. And they not only work for healthy food, but they work to end the structural inequalities that come with getting access to healthy food, right? So the question is like, why though? Like, why is so much of food justice about race? Or why is so much of environmentalism in general about race? Well, because POC are the most hurt by hunger, food access, and diet-related diseases, right? And we can even go back to what Jen was saying, where race is relevant, but specifically for food justice, we know from what we just saw in those stats that POC are the most hurt by food access, hunger, and diet-related diseases, right? We also know that higher rates of food insecurity and poverty and the racial wealth gap are a direct result of systematic racial and gender discrimination, right, in every aspect of American life. And although we know that slavery with African Americans was abolished over 150 years ago, the legacy of that oppression still lives on in our structural governments, in our structural systems like nonprofits, et cetera, right? We also know that land and food have been weaponized throughout US history, right? So the food system as we know it was built in large part by controlling people of color through force, right? And that's including Native Americans, that's including Black folks, African American folks, Asian folks, especially the Chinese and Mexican folks, especially Mexican farm workers. But all people, all of those four, Native Americans, Black folks, Chinese, and Mexicans, when it comes to farm workers, they were very much so controlled by the government in that way. So those communities in particular were affected in other ways that other communities weren't, at least here in the States. Also, low-income white farmers have struggled with this in very real ways. So they're included, but they've never been discriminated against for their race. So the last thing I'm going to close out with is, aside from race, what are some of the influencers that make it hard to access food, right? We can put race aside, but we have income and employment, obviously. The risk for food insecurity increases when money to buy food is limited or not available, or high unemployment rates in low income populations make it hard. We also have disabled adults, right, who are super high risk. They're going through their own food challenges that people don't talk about a lot, and that's due to limited employment and healthcare related expenses. And then of course there's transportation, risk for food insecurity in neighborhoods where transportation options are limited, problematic, right? Or when there's lack of access to public transportation or personal vehicles, and then you have supermarkets that are super far away from where communities live. And then that leads into like the environment that one is in. People living in some rural areas or urban areas and low income neighborhoods obviously have limited access to full service whole food supermarkets. And what we find is, once again, bringing it back to race, predominantly Black and Hispanic neighborhoods have even fewer full service supermarkets, right? And that's what we know as what used to be called food deserts and is now called food apartheids. And we can talk about that in depth, the difference between those two. Now, when we look at a lot of what we just covered is what food justice has been doing and what it's still doing today, but how it's shifted in today is there's more farmers advocating for living wages for all people in the food system, farmers, farm workers, restaurant food workers, food service workers, people in the processing, truckers, drivers, etc. And the goal is to make sure that every person in the food system understands what healthy food is, but also that they have high enough wages to afford healthy food also. And then today we also see a lot of farmers on the front lines of making sure that homeless communities have access to fresh food. That's a new face to food justice, or a face that is, I guess, becoming more prevalent because younger farmers are making it a thing again. We also have mutual aid networks that are creating community fridges. And now me and a lot of other farmers are on the front lines of deciding to farm for community fridges or only for food banks, rather than trying to be a market farmer and having for profit veggies, but rather just say, how do we get subsidized so that we can just send all high quality fresh produce to food banks and to community fridge? And then we have a whole other layer of food justice that deals with schools. There's a lot of farmers trying to farm to school or farm to college. And then there's another layer of farm to prison and making sure that those that are in prison have access to high quality foods. I am open to whatever questions, and we can segue into that now, Kristen.